"If you must beg, beg wisely," the Duke said, his voice low enough to make the fire seem loud in comparison, and Evelyn Harper felt the weight of those words press against her ribs as she knelt on the cold marble floor, her thin gloves damp from melted snow, her breath still uneven from the long walk up the winding drive that stretched nearly half a mile through iron gates and silent stone statues that had watched her approach like judges waiting for a verdict, and yet she did not lower her gaze. Not now. Not when everything that mattered was already balanced on the edge of ruin. "Please, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "My family has nothing left to sell, nothing left to promise. I am not asking for mercy, only time." But Nathaniel Ashford did not answer. He simply stood before the towering fireplace, one hand resting lightly against the carved mantel, his silhouette cut from shadow and firelight, his expression unreadable in a way that made hope feel like a fragile and dangerous thing. And somewhere beyond the heavy doors of the great hall, the wind howled across the estate grounds, rattling the tall windows as if the storm itself had followed her here, refusing to let her forget what waited if she failed. And he watched her, not with cruelty, not even with indifference, but with a stillness that suggested calculation, as though he were measuring something far more valuable than money. And when he finally moved, it was only a single step forward, enough to close the distance just enough that she could feel the warmth of the fire reach her chilled skin. "You came alone," he said, not a question, and she nodded, lifting her chin just slightly. There was no one left to send. And something flickered in his eyes then, gone so quickly she could not be certain it had been real, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow, the walls of stone, the long shadows, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere down the corridor, all of it pressing inward until there was only the two of them and the unspoken truth hanging between them, that she had already given up everything except the last thing she still owned, her dignity, and even that was slipping, inch by inch, with every second she remained on her knees. "Do you understand what you are asking of me, Miss Harper?" he said quietly, and she did not look away, because if she did, she feared she might never look back again. "Yes," she answered, though the word tasted like something sharp and unfamiliar, and he studied her for a long moment, longer than comfort allowed, longer than pride could endure, until at last his gaze dropped, not to her face, but to her hands, trembling slightly despite her effort to still them, and then to the edge of her worn sleeve, the faint fray that betrayed how close she had come to nothing. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, but deeper, as though something beneath it had shifted. "3 nights," he said, and the words settled into the silence like a door closing. "You will remain here, under my roof, for 3 nights, and when you leave, your family's debt will no longer exist." And the world seemed to tilt, not violently, not suddenly, but enough that Evelyn felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to give way, because she understood what such an offer meant, or thought she did. And yet there was something in the way he said it, something restrained, controlled, that made it impossible to fully grasp. And for the first time since she had stepped into that hall, fear did not come from what she might lose, but from what she might have to give in return. And still, she did not move, because behind her, miles away, her family waited in a house that could not survive another winter. And here, before her, stood the only man who could change that fate with a single decision. And as the firelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows across his face, she realized with quiet certainty that whatever happened within these walls would not leave either of them unchanged. The word should have broken her, yet it did not. It lingered instead, suspended in the heavy air of the great hall, as Evelyn Harper slowly rose to her feet, her legs unsteady from the cold and the strain of holding herself upright for so long. And still she refused to sway, refused to show even the smallest fracture in the dignity she had carried with her through the storm, because if she allowed that to slip now, she feared she would lose far more than pride. 3 nights, she repeated softly, not as a question, but as something she needed to hear aloud to understand, and Nathaniel Ashford inclined his head just slightly, as though confirming a transaction already decided. "You will be given a room in the East Wing," he said, his tone measured, precise, each word placed carefully like a stone in a path she had no choice but to follow. Everything you require will be provided. You will not be disturbed unless I request your presence. And the formality of it unsettled her more than any harsh command could have, because there was no cruelty in it, no overt demand, only structure. And structure left no space for argument, no room for escape. And for a moment she wondered if this was how he conducted all things, with a calm that made resistance feel futile before it even began. "And my family," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, because they were the only anchor she had left. And his gaze shifted to her again, sharp, attentive, as though this, finally, was the question that mattered. "A physician will be sent before morning," he replied, and there was no hesitation, no pause for effect, just a simple statement delivered with the same quiet authority that had sealed her fate moments before. "Your household will receive provisions sufficient for the winter, and the matter of your debt will be held in suspension until you depart." And something inside her tightened, not with relief, not yet, but with the fragile beginning of it, the kind that felt dangerous because it could still be taken away, and she swallowed carefully, steadying herself against the sudden rush of emotion that threatened to rise too quickly. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt too small, too inadequate for what he had just offered, and yet they were all she had, and he did not respond to them, did not acknowledge them, as though gratitude was not something he required, or perhaps not something he believed in. And instead he turned slightly, the firelight catching along the edge of his profile, casting half his face into shadow. "Mrs. Whitmore will see to your accommodations," he added, and as if summoned by the sound of his voice, the distant echo of footsteps approached from the corridor beyond, measured and discreet, and Evelyn felt the moment slipping, the fragile, suspended space between them beginning to close, and yet she could not move. Not immediately, because something in his presence held her there, something unspoken that made leaving feel almost as uncertain as staying. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, Nathaniel looked at her once more, his expression unreadable but no longer entirely distant. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, and she met his gaze despite herself. "Do not misunderstand the nature of this arrangement." And the words settled between them with a weight that pressed against her chest. Not harsh, not threatening, but deliberate. "Nothing given here is without cost." And there it was, the truth laid bare without ornament or disguise. And for a heartbeat, she felt the room tilt again, felt the ground beneath her certainty shift just enough to remind her that she was standing at the edge of something she could not yet see. And still, she straightened, drawing what little strength she had left into her spine. "I understand," she answered, even though she knew, deep within her, that she did not fully, not yet. And as Mrs. Whitmore's presence reached the threshold of the hall, and the world beyond that moment began to return, with its corridors and doors and distant echoes, Evelyn realized that the storm she had walked through to reach this place had not ended at the gates. It had only changed form, and now it waited within these walls, quiet, controlled, and far more dangerous because of it. The corridor beyond the great hall felt impossibly long, its stone walls swallowing sound as Evelyn followed Mrs. Whitmore in silence, each step echoing faintly beneath her worn boots. And though the storm still raged somewhere beyond the towering windows, here the air was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the house itself held its breath, watching her pass. And she could not shake the feeling that she had crossed some unseen threshold the moment she accepted his terms, that whatever life she had known before had already begun to fade behind her like footprints in falling snow. "This way, Miss Harper," Mrs. Whitmore said gently, her voice measured but not unkind, and Evelyn nodded, though her thoughts were far from the polished floors beneath her feet, instead drifting back, unbidden, to the small house, nearly 20 miles away, where the fire would have long since burned low, where her mother would be sitting in quiet worry, pretending not to count the hours, and where her younger brother lay pale beneath thin blankets, his breath too shallow for a boy who should have been running through open fields instead of fighting for each fragile inhale. And the memory struck with a quiet force that made her chest tighten, because for the first time since she had left them, there was something different woven into that image, something that had not been there before, a possibility, fragile and uncertain, but real enough to make her press her lips together to keep from speaking it aloud. "Your room has been prepared," Mrs. Whitmore continued as they turned down a narrower passage lined with tall windows veiled in frost, the glass catching faint reflections of candlelight that flickered like distant stars. And Evelyn wondered how many nights had passed within these walls, untouched by warmth, untouched by laughter. How many stories had been lived and buried here without ever reaching the outside world? And then they stopped before a heavy wooden door, the kind that seemed to carry its own history in the grain of the wood. And when it opened, a wave of warmth greeted her, soft and immediate, carrying the scent of fresh linen and faint traces of lavender. And for a moment, she could only stand there, caught between disbelief and exhaustion, because nothing about this room matched the reality she had left behind. The fire was already lit, casting a steady glow across polished surfaces. A thick rug softened the floor beneath her feet, and on a small table near the window sat a tray of untouched food, simple but carefully arranged, as though someone had anticipated not just her arrival, but her hunger as well. "You may rest here," Mrs. Whitmore said, stepping aside to allow her entry. "If you require anything, you need only ring." And Evelyn nodded again, though the idea of asking for anything more felt almost impossible after everything that had already been given. And when the door closed quietly behind her, the silence returned, deeper now, enclosing her in a space that felt both safe and unfamiliar. And she moved slowly into the room, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the table as if to confirm that it was real, that she had not imagined this sudden shift from cold and scarcity to warmth and provision. And yet, even as relief began to settle, it did not bring comfort in the way she had expected, because beneath it, something else lingered, a quiet unease that curled at the edges of her thoughts, reminding her of the Duke's final words, "Nothing given here is without cost." And she closed her eyes briefly, drawing a careful breath, steadying herself against the weight of that truth, because she knew, with a certainty that did not require explanation, that whatever awaited her over the next 3 nights would demand more than she had ever been asked to give. And as the fire crackled softly behind her and the storm pressed against the windows beyond, Evelyn Harper stood alone in a room that offered warmth for the first time in weeks, and understood that comfort, here, was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Sleep did not come easily, even in a room warmed by steady firelight and softened by comfort she had nearly forgotten existed. Because Evelyn Harper lay awake long after the candles had burned low, her gaze fixed on the ceiling where shadows shifted with every quiet flicker of flame. And no matter how still the room remained, her thoughts refused to follow, drifting instead between 2 worlds that no longer seemed to belong to the same life. One where her family waited in fragile hope, and one where a man of immense power had drawn a line she had already stepped across. And somewhere in that distance between past and present, something within her had begun to change, though she could not yet name it. And when at last exhaustion claimed her, it was not gentle, but heavy, pulling her into a restless sleep filled with fragments of memory, her brother's faint smile, her mother's quiet strength, the cold road stretching endlessly beneath her feet. And then, just as suddenly, she was awake again, the gray light of morning pressing softly through the frost-laced window. And for a moment she did not move, did not breathe beyond the shallow rhythm that held her in place, because there was a single question that waited for her the instant she opened her eyes. Had any of it been real? And as she turned her head slightly, the answer revealed itself in the quiet order of the room, the neatly folded garments placed at the foot of the bed, the faint warmth lingering in the air, the untouched tray now refreshed with simple breakfast. And she closed her eyes briefly, not in denial, but in acceptance, because whatever this place was, whatever it demanded, she was already within it, and there was no returning to what had been before. And when she finally rose, the floor no longer felt cold beneath her feet, though the memory of that cold lingered in her bones, a reminder she could not afford to forget. And she dressed slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate as though preparing not for a day, but for something far more uncertain. And as she reached the door, her hand paused against the handle, not from hesitation, but from awareness, because beyond that threshold lay the first of the 3 nights she had agreed to. And though no hour had yet passed, she could already feel its presence, waiting. And when she stepped into the corridor once more, the house seemed different in the daylight, less shadowed, yet no less imposing, its silence unchanged, its air still carrying that quiet sense of observation, as if every step she took was noted, measured, and somewhere deeper within its walls, a door opened, distant but unmistakable, followed by the faint echo of footsteps that did not belong to her, and she knew, without needing to be told, that the day had already begun to move around her, that whatever arrangements had been set in motion the night before were unfolding with a precision she could neither see nor control, and as she descended the staircase, her gaze lifted instinctively toward the far end of the hall, where tall windows cast pale light across the stone floor, and there, standing as though he had always been there, was Nathaniel Ashford, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady and unyielding as the walls themselves. And though the distance between them was greater than it had been before, it felt, somehow, smaller, as if the space that separated them had already begun to close, not by movement, but by understanding, and when his eyes met hers, there was no surprise in them, no acknowledgement of her arrival as something new, only the quiet recognition of something that had already begun, and in that moment, Evelyn realized that the first night had not yet fallen, and yet whatever this was between them, this silent exchange of power and something far less defined had already taken its first breath. He did not greet her, not with words, not with any gesture that might soften the distance between them, and yet Nathaniel Ashford's gaze followed her as she descended the final steps, steady and deliberate, as if he had expected her at that exact moment, as if nothing within his world occurred without intention. And Evelyn felt that awareness settle over her like a second presence, unseen but impossible to ignore, and still she continued forward, each step measured, each breath controlled, until she stood at the edge of the light cast by the tall windows, where the pale morning filtered through frost and glass, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not in discomfort, but in something far more precise, something that felt almost like a test, and when he finally broke it, his voice carried the same quiet authority as before, unhurried, certain. "You slept," he said, and though it was phrased as a statement, there was something beneath it, something that suggested he had already anticipated the answer, and Evelyn inclined her head slightly. "Enough," she replied, and the simplicity of it seemed to hold his attention longer than a fuller explanation might have, because he watched her for a moment as though weighing not her words, but the restraint behind them, and then he turned, not fully away, but just enough to shift the balance of the space, to draw her forward without command, and she followed, not out of obedience, but because she understood, instinctively, that this was the path she had already agreed to walk, and the room beyond was smaller than the great hall, yet no less imposing, its walls lined with dark wood and shelves filled with neatly ordered books. A single desk positioned near the window where light fell cleanly across its surface, and there, resting against the polished wood, lay a sealed envelope, untouched, waiting, and Nathaniel moved to stand beside it, one hand resting lightly against the edge as he regarded her once more. "Your family will receive this before noon," he said, his voice even, controlled, and for a moment Evelyn did not move, her gaze fixed on the envelope as though it might vanish if she looked too closely, because within that single object lay everything she had come here for, every fear, every sacrifice, every step taken through cold and uncertainty, and yet when she reached for it, her hand did not tremble, because she knew this was not a gift, not truly, it was part of the cost, and she accepted it as such, her fingers closing gently around the paper. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time, not because the words carried more weight, but because she had nothing else to offer in their place. And he did not dismiss her gratitude, nor did he acknowledge it. Instead, his gaze shifted slightly, studying her as though this moment, this quiet exchange, revealed something he had not yet accounted for. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate rather than uncertain, he spoke again. "You will dine with me this evening." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that left no space for question, no need for explanation. And Evelyn felt the meaning of it unfold slowly, not in the words themselves, but in the understanding that this was the beginning, not the end, that whatever had been agreed upon the night before had only just begun to take shape. And though nothing in his tone suggested anything beyond simple formality, She could not ignore the shift beneath it, the subtle tightening of something unspoken, something that made the air feel just slightly heavier. And still she met his gaze without retreat. Because if she had learned anything since stepping into this place, it was that hesitation would only deepen the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. "As you wish," she answered, and for the first time, something almost imperceptible moved through his expression, not quite approval, not quite surprise, but something closer to recognition, as if in that moment he saw not just a woman bound by circumstance, but someone who had chosen, fully and without illusion, to stand where she now stood. And as the silence returned once more, deeper now, more defined, Evelyn realized that the first day had begun not with demands, nor with cruelty, but with something far more dangerous. Understanding the hours between his words and the coming evening did not pass in comfort, no matter how carefully the house attempted to offer it, because Evelyn Harper carried time differently now, each minute measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the quiet weight of what awaited her. And though the letter had already been sent, though somewhere miles away a physician would soon arrive at her family's door with provisions and promises that might change everything, she could not allow herself to rest in that knowledge. Not yet. Not while she remained here under the terms she had accepted. And so she moved through the day, with a kind of composed stillness, neither wandering nor retreating, as though the walls themselves might shift if she strayed too far from the center of whatever this arrangement required. And when at last the light outside the tall windows began to fade, softening from pale gray into the deepening blue of evening, a quiet knock sounded at her door, precise and measured, and when she opened it, a young maid stood waiting with a folded gown draped carefully over her arms, the fabric simple but elegant, far finer than anything Evelyn had worn in years. "For dinner, miss," the girl said softly, her eyes lowered not in dismissal but in respect. And Evelyn accepted it with a nod, her fingers brushing the smooth texture as though unsure it belonged in her hands. And when the door closed once more, she stood for a long moment in the fading light, the gown resting against her palms like something borrowed from a life she had never lived, and yet she dressed in it without hesitation, because, whatever this night held, she would not meet it as someone diminished. And when she finally stepped into the corridor, the house had changed again, the shadows deeper now, the air carrying the faint glow of candlelight that traced her path as if guiding her towards something inevitable. And the dining room revealed itself not with grandeur, but with restraint, a long table set for two, the silver polished, the candles steady, and at its far end, Nathaniel Ashford stood waiting, not seated, not distracted, but present in a way that made the room feel smaller, more contained. And as she approached, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that held neither warmth nor distance, only acknowledgement. And when she took her place, the silence that followed was not empty, but deliberate, filled with the quiet awareness of two people who understood that this moment carried more than it appeared to, and the meal itself unfolded without excess. Each course simple, precise, offered without commentary, and for a time neither spoke, the only sound the soft clink of porcelain and the steady rhythm of breath, until at last he set down his glass and looked at her fully, his gaze steady, unguarded in a way it had not been before. "Why did you not ask for more?" he said, and the question seemed to arrive without warning. Not sharp, but direct, and Evelyn paused, her hand still against the table, considering not just the words but the space behind them, because she understood that this was not about the debt, not about money or provisions, but something else entirely, something quieter. And when she answered, her voice did not waver, "Because I knew what I could not afford to lose." And the truth of it settled between them, clear and unembellished. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze holding hers as though searching for something deeper within that simple statement. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in his expression shifted, not softened, not entirely, but altered in a way that suggested the balance between them was no longer as fixed as it had been before. And as the candles flickered gently between them, casting light and shadow across the distance that remained, Evelyn realized that whatever this night had been meant to take from her, it had already begun to give something back, something far more dangerous than fear, because it was beginning to feel like understanding the silence that followed her answer did not break. It deepened, settling into the space between them like something newly awakened, and Nathaniel Ashford did not look away, not immediately, as though her words had shifted something he had not expected to move. And for a moment the steady rhythm of the evening paused, suspended in that quiet recognition, until at last he rose from his seat with a controlled ease that restored the balance of the room, though not entirely, because whatever had passed between them remained, subtle but undeniable. And when he moved toward the tall windows at the far end of the dining room, Evelyn felt the distance return, not as separation, but as something more deliberate, as if he needed it, and she remained where she was for a breath longer than necessary before standing as well, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table as she steadied herself against the unfamiliar shift in the air, and the candles flickered softly, their light tracing the outline of his figure as he paused before the glass, looking out into the darkened grounds where the storm had finally begun to quiet, leaving behind only a restless wind that whispered against the estate like a memory unwilling to fade. "You believe this is about loss," he said without turning, his voice quieter now, not distant, but no longer formal, and Evelyn stepped forward, closing part of the distance between them, though she did not presume to stand beside him. "Not yet." "Is it not?" she asked, her tone measured, because she understood that whatever this conversation had become, it was no longer bound by the simple terms of their arrangement. And he was silent for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. And then, slowly, he turned, his gaze finding hers with a clarity that felt sharper than before. "Loss is simple," he said. "It ends something." And there was no bitterness in his voice, only a certainty that carried weight. "What remains after is far more complicated." And the words lingered, not as a lesson, but as something lived, something he did not offer lightly, and Evelyn felt their meaning settle within her, because she understood that he was not speaking of her family, not truly, but of something else, something that had shaped him long before she had ever stepped into his world. And for a moment she considered stepping beyond the careful boundary they had maintained, but she did not, because she recognized the difference between what could be given and what must be earned, and instead she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging not just his words, but the trust it had taken to speak them. And something in his expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if he had expected resistance, or curiosity, or even intrusion, but not restraint, and that restraint altered the space between them more than any question could have. And as the quiet returned once more, it no longer felt like a barrier, but something shared, something that held rather than separated. And when he finally moved again, it was not to dismiss her, but to step past her, the faint brush of air as he did so enough to remind her how close they had come without ever truly crossing that distance. "The evening is not yet finished," he said, his voice returning to its earlier steadiness, though something beneath it remained changed, and Evelyn turned to follow, her pulse steady, her steps unhurried, because she understood now that whatever this night had been meant to test, it was no longer simply about endurance, nor about obligation, but something far more subtle, something that moved beneath words and actions alike. And as they left the dining room together, the door closing softly behind them, she realized that the first night had not demanded what she had feared. It had revealed something she had not expected, and that revelation carried its own quiet danger, because it made the next moment, and the one after that, impossible to predict. The corridor seemed quieter now, as though the house itself had withdrawn into a deeper stillness, and Evelyn followed several steps behind Nathaniel Ashford, her gaze drawn not to him, but to the shifting light that traced along the walls as they passed, each candle casting a narrow glow that faded too quickly into shadow. And she could not help but feel that she was walking through something unseen, something that did not announce itself but lingered in the spaces between movement and silence. And when he stopped at last, it was not before a grand chamber, or an imposing doorway, but a smaller room set apart from the others, its door slightly ajar, the faint warmth within spilling into the hall, and he pushed it open without hesitation, stepping aside only enough to allow her to enter first. And for a moment she paused, not out of fear, but from the quiet awareness that whatever lay beyond that threshold was not part of the arrangement she had imagined. and yet she stepped inside. Because turning back had ceased to be an option the moment she accepted his terms, and the room revealed itself slowly, lit by a single lamp set near a low table, its light soft, steady, and unlike the rest of the house. There was something lived within it, something that did not belong to formality or structure, and along the far wall, beneath a tall window veiled in thin fabric, stood a small writing desk, its surface marked not by disorder, but by use, a folded letter resting beside an unopened book, and Evelyn felt the shift immediately, the difference between a space meant to impress and one meant to be occupied. And when she turned slightly, Nathaniel had already moved further inside, his presence no longer defined by distance, but by proximity, and still he did not speak at once, as though allowing the room itself to settle around them. And when he finally did, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, not less controlled, but less guarded. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but as something closer to an invitation, and she obeyed without hesitation, taking the chair nearest the table, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly against her lap as she waited, and he remained standing for a moment longer before taking the seat opposite her. The space between them small now, defined not by the expanse of a hall, but by the width of a table that held no barrier, no distraction, and he reached for the letter without looking at it, his fingers resting against the edge as though he had not yet decided whether to open it. "This room is not used for guests," he said, and the statement carried something unspoken beneath it, something that made Evelyn's breath still for just a moment, because she understood that this was not coincidence, that she had been brought here deliberately, not as part of the agreement, but beyond it, and she met his gaze steadily, not questioning, not assuming, simply present, and for a moment neither of them moved, the quiet stretching between them not as tension, but as something more precise, something that required attention rather than reaction. And then, slowly, he slid the letter across the table toward her, the paper catching the light as it moved, and she recognized the seal immediately, her heart tightening before she could stop it, because it bore the mark of her home. And when she reached for it, her fingers brushed the edge of his hand, just for a second, nothing more than the faintest contact, but it was enough to shift something in the air, something that neither of them acknowledged, and she drew her hand back slightly before unfolding the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, the careful script of her mother, and as she read, the words settled into her like warmth. The physician had arrived, her brother was stable, the provisions had been delivered, and though the uncertainty had not vanished, hope had taken its place in a way that felt real, not imagined. And when she lowered the page, her gaze lifted slowly, meeting Nathaniel's once more, and for the first time since she had entered his world. There was no question in her expression, no hesitation, only quiet certainty. "You kept your word," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than gratitude ever could, and he held her gaze without shifting, without deflecting, as though that acknowledgement mattered more than anything else she might have offered. And in that moment, the space between them changed again, not because of what had been promised, but because of what had already been given, and neither of them spoke, because they both understood that whatever this night had become, it was no longer defined by terms, but by something far more difficult to name. The words remained between them long after she had spoken them, simple and unadorned, yet carrying a weight that neither of them dismissed, and Nathaniel Ashford did not look away, not from her, not from the quiet certainty that now stood where hesitation once had, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow, the soft glow of the lamp holding them within a space that no longer belonged to arrangement or obligation, but to something far less defined, and far more difficult to control. And when he finally moved, it was not to reclaim distance, but to lean back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was not considering her words, but what had led her to them. And Evelyn remained where she was, the letter still resting lightly in her hands, though her attention had shifted entirely, because she understood now that what had been given tonight had not ended with the fulfillment of a promise. It had only begun to reveal something deeper, something neither of them had intended to uncover. And the silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel like a boundary. It felt like a space being shared, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet clarity that felt closer than before. Most would have thanked me differently, he said, and though the words were neutral, there was something beneath them, something that suggested expectation, not of gratitude, but of reaction, and Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering him, not as a man who held power over her, but as someone who had just allowed a piece of himself to be seen without disguise. Most would have come for different reasons, she replied, and the answer did not challenge him, did not defy him, but it did not retreat either, and for a brief moment something almost resembling surprise touched his expression, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable, and then it was gone, replaced by that same composed stillness that had defined him from the beginning, and yet it no longer felt impenetrable, because she had seen, however briefly, the shift beneath it, and he studied her again, not with calculation now, but with something closer to understanding, as though he were recognizing a pattern he had not anticipated, and when he spoke again, it was quieter still. You do not ask what comes next, and there was no accusation in the words, only observation, and Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the letter before she set it gently back upon the table, her movements deliberate, controlled. Because I already know it will not be what I expect, she said, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. Because it required none, and something in his gaze shifted again, not in opposition, but in acknowledgement, as though she had spoken something he had long understood but never needed to hear aloud. And for a moment neither of them moved, the stillness deepening not into tension, but into something far more fragile, something that required neither explanation nor defense. And then, slowly, he reached forward, not to take the letter, but to turn it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table with a precision that seemed unnecessary, and yet deliberate, as though grounding himself in something tangible. There are still 2 nights remaining, he said, and the words carried the quiet reminder of what had been agreed. But they no longer felt like a condition, not entirely, because beneath them lay something else, something unspoken that had begun to take shape without permission, and Evelyn nodded once, not in submission, but in acceptance, because she understood that whatever those nights would bring, they were no longer defined solely by the terms she had accepted. And as she rose from her seat, the faint sound of the chair against the floor marking the end of something that had not been formally concluded, she felt the shift within herself as clearly as she had felt it within him, not as certainty, but as awareness, and when she turned toward the door, her steps unhurried, she did not look back immediately, because she did not need to. She could feel his gaze still resting where she had been, and only when her hand reached the handle did she pause, just briefly, before glancing over her shoulder, and in that single moment, their eyes met once more, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as 2 people who had stepped, however quietly, beyond it. And as she left the room, and the door closed softly behind her, Evelyn understood with a clarity that both steadied and unsettled her, that whatever had begun tonight would not end when the 3rd night came to pass. The door closed behind her with a softness that felt louder than any echo, and Evelyn Harper stood for a moment in the quiet corridor, her hand still resting against the handle as though the weight of that room had followed her out, lingering just beyond reach. And though the air was cooler here, less touched by the warmth of lamplight and conversation, something within her had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because she understood now that whatever she had expected to endure within these walls had already begun to change into something far less certain and far more dangerous. And as she moved slowly back toward her chamber, the silence of the house seemed to fold around her differently, no longer distant, no longer indifferent, but aware, as if every step she took carried a meaning she could not yet fully grasp. And when she reached her room and stepped inside, the fire had been tended in her absence, its steady glow casting familiar light across the space, and yet it did not feel the same, because she was no longer the same woman who had first crossed that threshold. And she crossed to the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she looked out over the darkened grounds where the storm had fully passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal. And for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, to let the weight of what had been given settle within her without resistance. Her family was safe. Her brother was receiving care. The debt that had shadowed every waking thought was no longer an immediate threat. And yet the relief that should have followed did not come in the way she had imagined, because it was tempered now by something else. Something quieter but no less present, the knowledge that she remained here by choice, not because she was forced, but because she had agreed, and that understanding carried its own quiet gravity, and she closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself against it, because she could not afford to lose clarity now, not when 2 nights still remained. And when she turned back into the room, her gaze fell upon the gown she had worn, carefully set aside, its soft fabric catching the firelight in a way that made it seem almost out of place in a life built on necessity rather than comfort. And she reached out, her fingers brushing the material lightly, not in admiration, but in recognition, because everything within this house, every gesture, every word, every silence, had been deliberate, and she was beginning to understand that nothing here existed without purpose, not even the space he had allowed her to occupy. And that realization settled deeper than any fear had, because it meant that whatever had begun between them was not accidental. And as the hours passed, marked only by the slow fading of the fire and the steady rhythm of her breath, sleep came more easily this time, not because her mind was free of thought, but because it had begun to accept the unknown as something that could not be avoided. And when morning came again, it did not arrive with hesitation, but with a quiet clarity, and Evelyn rose with it, her movements calm, her purpose no longer defined by desperation alone. And as she prepared to step once more into the corridors of Ashford Hall, she understood that the second day would not test her in the same way the first had, because what had been revealed the night before could not be returned to silence. And somewhere within the walls that surrounded her, Nathaniel Ashford was already moving through his own thoughts, already shaping what would come next. And for the first time since she had arrived, Evelyn did not brace herself against what awaited her. She stepped toward it, fully aware that whatever this arrangement had been meant to take, it was beginning, slowly and without permission, to change them both. Morning did not bring distance. It brought clarity, and Evelyn Harper felt it the moment she stepped beyond her chamber. The quiet of Ashford Hall no longer pressing against her as something unknown, but unfolding instead like a pattern she was beginning to recognize. And though the air remained still, the weight within it had shifted, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but with something far more deliberate, as though every moment that followed now carried intention. And when she reached the lower hall, she did not need to search for him, because Nathaniel Ashford was already there, standing near the tall windows where pale light spilled across the stone floor, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been the night before. And yet there was something different in the way he regarded her now, not colder, not warmer, but clearer, as if whatever distance had once defined them had been quietly acknowledged and set aside. And she crossed the space between them without hesitation, her steps measured, her gaze steady, because she understood that whatever had begun could no longer be approached with the same caution. And when she came to a stop a few feet from him, he did not speak immediately, his eyes resting on her with a focus that felt less like observation and more like consideration. And when he finally did, his voice carried none of the formality that had once framed their exchanges. "The physician sent word this morning," he said, and the words reached her before the meaning fully formed, and she felt her breath still just slightly, not in fear, but in anticipation. "Your brother is improving," he continued, and though his tone remained controlled, there was no mistaking the certainty within it, and something within her shifted in response, not outwardly, not in a way that would break the composure she had held so carefully, but inwardly, where relief settled deeper than she had allowed herself to hope. And she lowered her gaze briefly, not to hide emotion, but to steady it, because gratitude, real gratitude, was a fragile thing. When spoken too quickly, and when she lifted her eyes again, there was no hesitation in them, only quiet acknowledgement. "You have done more than I asked," she said, and the truth of it carried through her voice without embellishment. And for a moment he said nothing, as though the words did not require response, only recognition. And then he turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the far end of the hall where a servant passed silently in the distance. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, more deliberate. "And yet you remain." And the statement was not a question, but it held one within it. And Evelyn felt it clearly, not as pressure, but as an opening, and she did not look away, because she knew that whatever answer he sought, it was not one she could offer lightly. And so she chose honesty, not because it was expected, but because it was the only thing that would not fracture what had begun between them. Because leaving now would not change what this has become, she said. And the words settled between them with a weight that neither of them dismissed, and something in his expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if he had anticipated resistance, or perhaps uncertainty, but not this, not the quiet acceptance of something that had already moved beyond agreement. And he studied her for a moment longer, his gaze steady, searching not for weakness, but for truth. And finding it, he inclined his head slightly, not as acknowledgement of her words, but of her choice. And as the silence returned once more, it no longer felt like a space waiting to be filled, but one that had already been shaped by what had been spoken. And in that stillness, Evelyn understood something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that the second day was not about endurance, nor about obligation, but about what remained when both had already been set aside. And as Nathaniel turned and began to walk, his steps unhurried, she followed without question, not because she was bound to him, but because she had chosen, and that choice, quiet as it was, had already begun to change everything. The day unfolded without announcement, yet everything within it carried a quiet precision that made each moment feel intentional. And Evelyn Harper walked beside Nathaniel Ashford through a part of the estate she had not yet seen, the corridors giving way to a long gallery where tall windows stretched nearly 12 feet high, their panes clear now that the storm had passed, allowing winter light to spill across polished floors and faded portraits that watched from the walls with silent familiarity. And though the space was vast, it did not feel empty. It felt inhabited by memory, by time, by something that had endured long before either of them had entered it. And Nathaniel slowed his steps as they reached the far end, where a single door stood slightly apart from the rest, its surface unadorned, almost plain in contrast to the grandeur surrounding it. And for a moment he did not open it, his hand resting lightly against the handle as though the act required more than simple movement. And Evelyn did not speak, because she understood that this pause was not hesitation, but choice. And when the door finally opened, the room beyond revealed itself not with light, but with stillness, a quiet space where the air felt different, softer, untouched by the rhythms of the rest of the house. And inside, there was little, a small writing table, a chair, and a single portrait set upon the wall opposite the window. And Evelyn felt the shift immediately, the difference between this room and all the others she had seen, because this space did not belong to structure or order, it belonged to something held, something remembered, and Nathaniel stepped inside without looking back, his presence changing the room not by command, but by familiarity. And she followed, her steps slower now, not from uncertainty, but from awareness, because she knew, without needing to be told, that she had not been brought here by accident. And when she came to stand beside him, her gaze lifted to the portrait, a woman captured in stillness, her expression calm, her eyes holding something that felt both distant and present at once. And though Evelyn knew nothing of her, she understood immediately that this was not merely an image, it was a presence, one that had shaped the silence Nathaniel carried within him. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the room settling around them like something shared, something that did not require explanation. And when he finally did, his voice was lower than before, not weakened, but unguarded in a way she had not yet heard. She believed in things that did not last, he said, and the words carried no bitterness, only truth. And Evelyn did not ask who the woman was, because she already knew that the answer mattered less than what he had chosen to reveal. And instead she remained still, her presence steady, her silence offering something words could not. And for a moment the distance between them shifted again, not closing, not entirely, but changing in a way that made it impossible to return to what had been before. And Nathaniel turned slightly then, his gaze finding hers with a clarity that held no defense, no calculation, only the quiet recognition of something he had not intended to share. And she met it without hesitation, not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough. And in that moment, the second day reached something deeper than the first had touched, because it was no longer about what had been given or promised, it was about what had been shown. And as they stood together in that quiet room, The world beyond its walls seemed distant, almost irrelevant, because whatever had begun between them had now stepped beyond obligation entirely, and into something neither of them could yet define, but both could feel with unmistakable certainty the room held its silence even after they left it, as though what had been revealed there refused to follow them into the rest of the house. And yet, Evelyn Harper carried it with her all the same, not as a burden, but as something far more difficult to define, something that had settled beneath her composure and altered it without breaking it. And as the final evening approached, she felt the weight of it not as dread, but as inevitability, because the third night was no longer something to endure. It was something that would decide what remained when everything else had already changed. And when she entered the great hall once more, she did not hesitate at the threshold, did not pause as she had on the first night, because she understood now that there was no version of herself waiting beyond that door, only the one she had become, and Nathaniel Ashford stood where he always seemed to be, as though the house itself had been built around his presence. Steady, immovable, and yet when his gaze met hers, there was no distance left in it, only the quiet recognition of something that had already passed between them and could not be undone. And for a moment neither spoke, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to define, and when he finally moved toward her, the space between them closed without resistance, without hesitation, until they stood near enough that the silence itself seemed to shift, becoming something held rather than empty, and she felt it then, clearly, not as fear, not as uncertainty, but as understanding, because whatever this arrangement had begun as, it had moved beyond its own boundaries, and he knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "You may leave in the morning," he said, and the words were simple, direct, but they did not land as release, not entirely, because beneath them lay something else, something unspoken that changed their meaning, and Evelyn held his gaze, her expression steady, because she understood what he was offering, not just freedom from the agreement, but freedom from him. And yet the thought did not bring the relief it once would have, because leaving now would not return her to who she had been. It would only carry this with her, whatever this had become, and for a moment she said nothing, allowing the truth of that to settle fully, because she would not answer him without understanding her own choice. And when she did speak, her voice was quiet, but unwavering. "And you?" she said, not asking, not demanding, but acknowledging the question he had not spoken, and something in his expression shifted then, not in surprise, but in recognition, as though he had expected her to accept the offer without hesitation, without reflection, and instead she had met it with something equal, something that did not yield, and he looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the world beyond that space seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them and the truth neither had planned to face. And when he finally answered, his voice was lower than before, carrying a weight that no longer belonged to control. "I do not know what remains," he said, and the honesty of it settled between them with a quiet finality, because it was not uncertainty that defined it, but the willingness to admit it, and Evelyn felt something within her steady in response, not because she had found clarity, but because she no longer needed it to move forward. And as the last of the evening settled around them, the fire casting long shadows that flickered and faded along the walls, she understood that this was not an ending, not truly, because what had begun here could not be contained within 3 nights, nor concluded by their passing. And when she finally turned, not away from him, but toward the path that would lead her beyond these walls, she did so without hesitation, because she knew that whatever waited beyond would not erase what had been formed within them. And as she paused at the edge of the hall, her hand resting lightly against the cold stone, she did not look back immediately, because she did not need to. She could feel his presence still, steady, unyielding, and yet no longer distant. And when she did turn, just once, their eyes met across the space, not as strangers, not as debtor and duke, but as two people who had crossed something neither of them had intended to. And in that quiet moment, before the world returned and choices were made beyond it, Evelyn Harper understood that some things were not given, nor taken, but recognized, and once recognized, they could never truly be set aside.